and share with us again. Thank you.
First, thank you all for having me, I hope it's okay if I speak without a mic. I have a really big mouth, loud voice. If you don't believe me, ask ODOT. Speaking of, I'd just like to have a little advertisement. Robert Newman and I recently finished a book. We have a full draft. We're going through the editing process on the early history of Mariemont. The Mariemont Preservation Foundation has done a wonderful job of documenting from 1926 to the present. This book will be 1926 all the way back to the beginning of human occupation of Mariemont. So it's something to look forward to down the road. Hopefully it'll be used in all the schools, and I know we'll use it at the University of Cincinnati as well. As was mentioned right off the bat, a lot of people know about the Madisonville site, Mariemont swimming pool area. I mean, not surprisingly, it is, next to Cahokia, the single most important archaeological site in all of eastern North America. I mean, I've been in the parking lot many times and listened to people speak German. People literally come from around the world to come to Mariemont to look at the Madisonville site. Well, one of the things, thanks to Mayor Dan Policastro for inviting the University of Cincinnati, what we found in the lower 80 is actually a complex of archaeological sites. The Madisonville site is essentially a cemetery, and I'll show you, give you some idea of the extent of that cemetery, the size of it. And it was also an area where people stored material to get them through the winter, through the starvation months. But the big question has always been, where did the people live? Well, hopefully I can answer that this evening. This is an aerial photo of the lower Little Miami River Valley, and for the past almost a month now, I've been working with our graduate students, and starting June 1st, in fact June 1st we'll be in the lower 80, with a group of 10 undergraduates and 3 graduate students mapping and surveying. So periodically, often, I mean, yesterday I was in a ditch this deep and covered with honeysuckles with a machete, so I have to go places where most people don't want to go. But they're good areas to see exposures of the sediment in these areas. So if you don't see us down there, it's not surprising. We're really in the boonies, so to speak. Now you probably recognize, you can see where we're at. You can spot the Mariemont Center quite clearly. This is an aerial photo. But what I like to do, thanks to a geographic program called Geographic Information Systems, I can use a flyover using laser imaging called LiDAR and bring it into a program called Geographic Information System and look at this area. What it does is strip away the buildings, strip away the trees, and just shows us the landforms. And it's amazing, for an archaeologist, it's a nice prospecting tool as well. And I want to point out some of the features, and here it is. What I'd like to first do is point out the Madisonville site. And the Madisonville site is right there. There's Mariemont swimming pool. Here's the Madisonville site. So you can get some idea of the perspective of the size of that. Here's, of course, the railroad. This is Clare Railroad Yards. This is where the trestle is. It's not a landform, so it doesn't show up on this LiDAR image. I do want to bring your attention, however, and I'm pointing this out only because I trust you all. No one's going to go run with your shovel and start digging, but there's an extremely rare archaeological site. And again, it's not the Madisonville site, but I would argue it's part of the complex of archaeological sites in the area. And you can see it right here, and it's relatively pristine. I did show several hundred 4th graders from Mariemont Elementary School. My ears are still ringing, by the way. Those teachers don't get paid enough. But nevertheless, us. Here you can see one of the largest burial mounds in the county, right there. And most people, this plot of land here is actually not part of the Madisonville site. It's a different archaeological site known as the Spice Bush Woods. Of course, now it's mostly, there's still a lot of spice bush. And what's interesting here is going up just from this part, of course, Dogwood Park's over here, but there's a line of houses along here, beautiful English Tudor homes. But what you can see, this is also what's called the Stites Archaeological Site area. It's a group of archaeological sites, even though the houses are there and there's yards, those earthworks are still there. One of the things I discovered today, and I sent an email out, I finally was able to access the State Historic Preservation Office records, which ODOT uses. So for this entire geographic area, I could not find one archaeological site that was plotted correctly. Not one. And that's what ODOT's using to put in, to plan their highway. So one of the things that we're doing is going back and relocating these areas using a high-end GPS. So we have precise location. One of the interesting things is our work, even though we submitted the site forms and the National Register nomination forms, it's not on the records yet, and I've reminded them. So we're going to do everything we can to keep them honest. But so here's this very large mound. Here's the swimming pool area. Very, very large burial mound. There's remarkable artifacts, as I showed the fourth graders laying on the ground. There's still a lot of the Madisonville site left. But what I want to show you is the Wynema site, which we spent 2 years excavating with the help of many of the people here. But it extends from the Clare Railroad yards from here. In fact, it's 4 feet beneath the surface buried here. It's also on the other side of the railroad tracks. Even though there's pavement there, we went to areas where there was no pavement and actually cored down, and sure enough, they did not destroy it. They put the pavement on top of it. So essentially, it extends from here to here. So it's from this area here to this area here. Right here is where that large electrical tower is. So you get some idea of the size compared to the Madisonville site. It's extremely large and again, very, very rare. Another thing I want to draw your attention to, this shows where the Little Miami River used to be. Today is its current channel. And I know it's hard. Everyone wants to look at it and think, even myself, riding, I did 110 miles on the bike trail earlier this week. And I love pedaling along the bike trail and looking at the river, thinking about, well, Shawnee canoes going down and all that. Well, no. The Little Miami River today looks nothing like it did in the past. That's important. The reason, look at the width of the channel. Here you can see, this is a good example, this is an old meander scar. Note the width of the river. Here's another meander scar. This is what the width of the river used to be here. Look at the width. And of course, not surprising, here's our village site, the Wynema site, and look, there's an old stream channel. That's part of the trail system, and many of you have walked through there. What's nice about the trail system, we now have a really nice archaeological site here, and another one here. There's another archaeological site down here, another here, and they're all related. They're all related. It's somewhere along the lines, this was all actually part of a National Register district. The river used to the Hunt Field Village site is here. It actually all was a continuation. It's the same people. They're moving around. Even with our most precise radiocarbon dates, the standard error plus or minus is 25 years. In other words, and that's 65% probability. If you want to double that for 95% probability, that's plus or minus 50 years. In other words, there's no way on this planet that we can distinguish 50 years. Well, chances are a village moved 5 times areas had dirt floors, they had twig walls, and they had thatch roofing. Well, eventually that gets filthy. Not to mention down here, this area, as you well know, gets flooded. So you have to move above the floodplain till the floods go back down. So just some things to thinking about. But these are the original river channels. And there's another one. This one dates to about the 16th century AD. It was established. But there was an older channel, and it's almost invisible on the surface right here. It's Whiskey Run Creek here. But anyway, this is an invaluable, and here you can see the burial mound and Oddfellows Cemetery here. And there are a whole lot of other archaeological features that show here. But I just want to give you some idea of the perspective of what's in your own backyard. Speaking of your own backyard, it's amazing when of course the weather is kind of like it is today. This was March. We were out. Some of you, I don't know if you recognize where we're at here. One of the things that when ODOT was putting in the Milford extension, they wiped out untold number of archaeological sites. And the paid archaeologists who work for ODOT, one of the things they argued, oh, nothing survives, it's all been disturbed. Well, that's their standard line. So the nice thing, one of the things you'll see us walking with is this big giant letter H. We also use hand cores and what we call a bucket auger, an auger we screw in the ground to get samples. But one of the things I wanted to test, how sensitive is this? Does everyone recognize the family park?
Yeah.
Well, whether you realize it or not, that intersection, there used to be a toll bridge there. And right in the center of the park, there was a large burial mound. Of course, that's long since gone. That disappeared in the late 1800s. But around the earthwork, around the burial mound, there was a circular earthwork. Now today, that looks perfectly flat, right? So, but turns out the earthwork's still there. And there's subsurface features. This park, even with the sidewalks, it's still intact. By the way, that's Jocelyn, that's Dr. Chris Carr from the Department of Geography on the right. But one of the things I want to draw your attention to, and we were able to find this site, but I didn't realize you can actually see some of it with your own eye, if you haven't already picked it up. So here's the earthwork. So starts here. Here you can see the circle, goes around here, comes around there. And here you can see the depression, the rise in the earthwork. Here's the depression right here, coming around here. So it's a circular, really nice circular earthwork. So, and they removed this site from the records saying it's no longer there, but it is in fact still there. So again, this was just kind of a fun test. By the way, we spent a day there. No one stopped, no one questioned it. It was just like business as normal.
What park is it?
The family park, right across the street from where the Civic Association used to meet. The old elementary school.
Statuary Park.
But the corner
Next
of
to
Wooster Pike and Plainville.
Okay.
So Dr. Charles Metz documented this site and did a wonderful, beautiful watercolor of the site back in the around 1878. So, but anyway, I want to show you the kinds of equipment. And it was mentioned one of the prizes of the upcoming is this painting by Mary Lou Holt. And a lot of people, comes to mind, speaking of thatched roof, isn't this archaeo-fantasy? Where does this come from? So I wanted to give you some idea. Everything in here has reality. Of course, where the placement of the river is, but what I'd like to do is just show you some of the basis. I brought artifacts before, so I brought just a few items you haven't seen. Does everyone see what's going on right here? A young woman making pots, and you see the little girls making little pots just like their mother. Well, part of this is ethnographic. Cross-culturally, in the entire Western Hemisphere, women make pottery. Well, if that isn't enough, what we find at the Wainema site and also at the Madisonville site is fingerprints on the pottery. If any of you have reached down and illegally picked up a pot shirt, I know no one's done it, me neither, but you probably found a fingerprint impressed. Well, whether you realize it or not, an old forensic tool used in the 1950s is the swirls, the loops in your fingerprints. Men have different ones than women. So long before we had DNA to look at Y chromosomes or mitochondrial DNA or even autosomal DNA, we could look at fingerprints. The fingerprints on the pottery are all that of women and young girls. So the question is, where the young girls come from? We know ethnographically when the Jesuits came in with the voyageurs, when the French and before that the Spanish came in, they documented it. That's all published. You can read it. It's called The Jesuit Relations. It's been translated from Spanish and French. But nevertheless, this is from the Wainema site. One, it's very rare because it's perfect. There's nothing wrong. This is not an adult-made pot. Please be careful with it. I'm going to pass it around. You can see my trowel marks on the, despite how careful I was. I thought it was just a potsherd, but this is an example. The fingerprints on here are consistent with a very young girl who would have made this pot. And if you look in the center, if you have it, get under the right light, you can actually see the coiling that was made as well. So young girls making pottery. What's the evidence? There it is. So, and again, everything in this painting I can do the same thing. But please be careful. I have bubble wrap to pass it around, but I do want
Ken,
you to.
where did you find that?
That comes from the Wainema site. That's
Right
this
there.
year's find. Yeah, it was eroding out. So
You found it this year?
yeah. So early on, I go down there. I run down there. So even though I live in Kentucky, it's Mariemont's my home away from home. What can I say? So, but nevertheless, another interesting thing is the woman being a scarecrow. Well, again, ethnographic literature. Algonquian people have used at European contact. That's what do you? In other words, everyone in the community has a function. So if you're too old to walk, has anyone heard of Kokopelli? Kokopelli, everyone? You know the story of Kokopelli? Kokopelli is in the American Southwest among Puebloan cultures, the people such as the Tewa, the Hopi. What do the elderly who have gone blind? What do? Well, they can still earn a living. So what Kokopelli does, Kokopelli comes in where they're sleeping and starts playing the flute. And the older women get up, and Kokopelli starts moving, it's kind of like the Pied Piper. Kokopelli blows the flute, and the women follow the flute, and then Kokopelli continues till they're out in the cornfield, and then Kokopelli stops playing. And the women sit down. Well, having women in a cornfield keeps the crows away. And then later at the end of the day, Kokopelli, the flute player, comes back and leads them back. But I know that's a Hopi story, but ethnographically, the idea of scarecrows, where the name actually comes from originally, it's an American Indian. Of course, Europeans saw this going on as early as Jamestown, and they said, oh, this is insulting to our elderly, and they made straw people that they put in, and that's where scarecrows come from. But notice she's on a bear skin. This, the same bone here. Any medical doctors in here? Tell me what that bone is.
Metacarpal.
Absolutely. It's a metacarpal. Notice I have no knuckle. I broke this one, compound fracture. So, but nonetheless. What's interesting is the metacarpal and carpals, the hands and feet bones, are of bear. In fact, every year the FBI, someone turns in essentially decaying, what looks like is a decaying hand, and all the end of the fingers have been cut off, so it looks like a mob hit, but it's actually a bear claw. We actually had I was working in Little Miami River Valley, and we actually had one of these John or Jane Doe coffins. We ended up using it to put our tools in after we cleaned it out. But someone, for fun, threw a pair of bear paws in there. But this is Ursus americanus. This is the black bear. And notice it's also been smudged. It's darkened. So where's our evidence of bear? So, and again, when you skin a bear, one of the things is you like to leave the claws behind. The chitinophosphatic aspect of the actual claw itself, equivalent to our fingernails, of course, are long since gone, but the front paw bones, there it is. So there's our evidence for Ursus americanus. Well, look at the time of year. We see helianthus, we see sunflower in full bloom, we see the sycamore trees, and we see it both in the foreground and off in the distance, as well as the silver maple in full leaf. Where's that come from? Well, part of the evidence comes from this. Now you have to remember, when the climate changes, the number of frost-free days change as well. In other words, when we have seasonal downturns, when does spring start? When does winter start? When does summer, and so on and so forth. These are bison from the lower 80, the Wainema site. With the difference between this specimen and this specimen, they're both of individuals of the same age. You can see what's called the occlusal surface. Any dentists here? So, but anyway, that's the chewing surface, and you can actually run your finger over this one. This is a bison tooth. Bison did not come back into eastern North America. They were extirpated. In other words, they did go extinct, but they were still in the western hemisphere about 13,000 years ago. But all of a sudden, around somewhere around AD 1500, bison show up again. The whole Dances with Wolves, if you've seen that movie, that's recent. That didn't go on since time immemorial. What we had was a little ice age and a population explosion of bison. All of a sudden we had bison from the Atlantic to the Pacific and everywhere in between. And guess what? Bison show up in Mariemont at that time period. This one's thermally altered. This ended up in a fire. And you can compare the two. This one's actually, we can get DNA out of this specimen. But, and actually we have examined the stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes to see what the bison were eating. Turns out the bison that were living in Mariemont at that time were browsing on what we call C3 grasses, C3 photosynthetic pathway grasses. But what's interesting, tooth eruption. When a tooth erupts in a bison, or a deer for that, or a raccoon, or a squirrel, well, they don't have calves. If you've gone down to Big Bone Lick, they're not having calves every day. They're seasonal. You can watch squirrels a certain time of year. You know when it's mating behavior. If you look at Canada geese right now, they're goslings. I know they're swimming in my pond. Even the mallards and the wood ducks all have little ducklings now. Well, the same thing with mammals. The eruption gives us seasonality. This seasonality indicated by these teeth, and also with the isotopic studies that we've done on the bison remains from Mariemont, also suggests a seasonal occupation. In other words, warm weather. You've been down there in the winter and during the spring when it floods. Not a nice place to be. So I'll pass these around. Again, just why do we have what we have? And now what I'd like to also bring up is that the kinds of sites that are here in Mariemont are extremely rare. Extremely rare. There's two time periods in Mariemont's past where we have almost no evidence of human occupation. It's a very rare occupation. One is at the beginning of prehistory, during the last ice age, when mammoths and mastodons, giant beavers and giant ground sloths were roaming the area. The other time is at historic contact. The number of sites where we actually have tribal affiliations are extremely rare. Now, if you look at the archaeological sites, for example, of the Madisonville site, or across the river, Hahnfield, or even in the lower 80, you think, well, we call this Fort Ancient, named after Fort Ancient Park, where one of our students, Jack Blosser's the director, where it was originally excavated by Warren K. Moorhead, who was basically a grave robber and collector, but nevertheless. One of the King family, by the way, King's Mill, King's Powder, anyway, that same family. But that's the type site. And for many years the question was, who are these people? Well, guess what? We now have genomic anthropology. We can extract both degraded mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes from human bones, and we know that these are Algonquian-speaking people. But what's interesting, Mariemont gives us an even better clue. When were the last American Indians living in this area? And that's where the story gets really interesting. When we look at, in other words, who are the people living in the lower 80? Who were the people at the Madisonville site? Well, when we look at the Treaty of Fort Finney, that was cut in 1786. I don't know how many of you have been to the Miami power plant or past it on the where the Great Miami comes into the Ohio River. That's where a small blockade was built. That was supposed to be Cincinnati. There was another comparable blockade at a place where basically, anyone heard of Camp Washington, Chile? The original, original Cincinnati, Chile. That was Camp Washington. There was a blockade there. And the blockade there was to make sure the Shawnee were headed west. The blockade at Fort Finney was built, and I have a piece of this in our curation facility. If you ever want to come out, I'll show you the only surviving piece of Fort Finney. It was to make a treaty with the Shawnee, who at that time were inhabiting what's today Shawnee Lookout Park, part of the Great Parks of Hamilton County system. And what's interesting, you can say this is the actual treaty, and you can see the signatures of the Shawnee. Not many people signed them, not surprising. Why didn't Cincinnati end up there, by the way, just to digress for a moment? Some of you may know. The commander there was having an affair with the wife of the commander at Camp Washington. So after the treaty, he abandoned his fort and moved to Camp Washington so he could be close to the commander's wife. And that's why Cincinnati's where it is today. Again, the more ideal location would have been at the Great Miami River, but that's history. But later, that treaty was the predecessor of the Treaty of Greenville of 1795, which essentially said all American Indians living in the state of Ohio had to move west of the Great Miami River. This is the actual treaty, and these are the signatures, and again, the Shawnee had writing, and you can, although you might call them pictographs, each one actually can be well translated, but again, not a lot of Shawnee signed this treaty. In fact, most Shawnee did not. That's why a guy named Tecumseh, as it said in Shawnee, you know him better as Tecumseh, said, we need to unite, we will not stand for this treaty, and of course started a war with the United States. Well, that began in 1795. Whether or not you realize it, does anyone tell me the last occupation of Shawnee in Mariemont?
1896.
We think 1810. The war parties continued. In fact, at that time, take yourself back to 1810. At that time, the closest place to live was what's today Madisonville. The center, the crossroads of Madisonville, was known as Bryan Station. Well, the Bryan family, they were the wealthiest in the area in southwestern Ohio at that time. They had a handful of horses and a couple cows and made them wealthy. By the way, guess where they kept those? I don't know. I remember it. I used to get ice from there. But there used to be an ice house, I don't know how many of you remember, where Madison Road, Plainville Road, and Camargo all come together, that triangular intersection. I remember it, we got ice from there. But anyway, most people, it's amazing, most people go blank when I say that. But that's where the Bryan Station Corral was. Well, people living at Bryan Station would go down to what's called Turkey Bottoms. They'd come to right through the area where we're at right now. They'd go down the bluff, down past the Madisonville site, and on down to the confluence of Duck Creek and the Little Miami River. Does everyone know what that is today? Armletter Park. And there's no marker there. In fact, we've been able to find that site. 2 weeks ago we were out there coring. We have a permit from the Great Parks of Great Parks of Hamilton County, and also the Cincinnati Park Board graciously gave us a permit. We now have permits to work the entire valley. But what's interesting, a father and son and a group of friends went down there to hunt turkeys. Well, the Shawnee used 2 pieces of cedar, red cedar. You probably know it's actually juniper. But if you take a very narrow piece of broken cedar and take a round piece of cedar and rub it together, it sounds just like a turkey. And they called those hunters in, and when they got close enough, they killed the father and son. And one of the members, everyone else ran off, but one of the members, a young man, stayed and used all of his shot to defend himself against the Shawnee. By the way, guess where the Shawnee were camped? In the lower 80, Mariemont Bottoms. So anyway, they chased him. They followed that young man back to where he was, and once he got into Bryan Station, it was built as a blockade, so they decided not to press the issue. But they did go down to the corral and steal all the horses. Unbeknownst to one of them, one of the horses was lame. And once they realized the horses were being stolen, everyone at Bryan Station chased after the Shawnee raiding party and chased them up to the top of the hill above that intersection. And they, of course, the lame horse wasn't running as fast, so they caught up to the Shawnee on that and killed the Shawnee on that lame horse. They buried him on top of that hill and named it Indian Hill. Does everyone wonder where the name Indian Hill came from? So another reason, in other words, we have all the way to 1810 occupation of the Shawnee. Although after these treaties, the reason I bring up the treaties, it was intermittent. After that, it was being used as war camps. That's why this area is so very, very important. But now, what are some of the evidence of European occupation? Again, these are recent discoveries. They're too fragile to have brought in, so I have slides. But this is what we call a hawk bell. This was made by Spanish copper. And you say, well, how can you tell that? Well, it turns out the rare earths and heavy metals, trace amounts in the metal, are very different from North America compared to Europe. In fact, Spain is different from England, is different from Italy. The trace elements, I had a student do a master's thesis and on the copper from here in Mariemont, and sure enough, it all traces to the Spanish. What's interesting, it's 16th century, it dates to the time of De Soto. Does everyone know who De Soto was? He was a conquistador who came across with Jesuits, what the Shawnee called black robes, across the southeast, but he sent his men, scouts, on up across the Ohio River. So we know that the Shawnee, who were in the lower 80, were in direct contact with the Spanish. This isn't the only bit of evidence. This is a Spanish iron axe. Again, iron, like the same as copper, has a chemical fingerprint. I don't like the word signature because our signatures change through time. Our fingerprints do not. So, by the way, in the Mariemont Preservationist Foundation collection, I noticed when I was going through the records, there's one like this on display, the twin to this. So this would have also come from the De Soto expedition. It was the only expedition, only source of Spanish metal at that time, and that's from the Wainema site. So one of the things that we have here in Mariemont is direct positive evidence, not only for Fort Ancient, but the Fort Ancient are the Shawnee. The other place we have it, by the way, guess where the bison molars likely, we use something I can tell where you've been in your life. Give me a tooth, like you're going to do that. Or let me drill a little hole in your tooth, and I can look at the stable strontium isotopes. Whether you realize it or not, when you drink water, that water is indicative of your travels. So you can tell where I've been around the world by looking at the strontium in my teeth. Based on the strontium in the bison, we know those bison were moving from Mariemont to Big Bone Lick, Kentucky. So they were going back and forth. Big Bone Lick, Kentucky, the reason I'm excavating there in June is because we have the counterpart of artifacts that are found in Mariemont. So the Shawnee that were living here in Mariemont were moving down there. There, we not only have Fort Ancient pottery identical to what's found at the Wainema site and the Madisonville site, we have musket balls with it. So, anyway. So what do we have down here? So, in other words, when we think of Shawnee, these are other paintings by Mary Lou Holt, we think about, again, guns were already here. They were trade items. Do we have any guns from Mariemont so far? No. On the other hand, we do have this. This is from the lower 80. I don't know how many of you recognize this. No matches back then. How did Europeans start fires?
Flint.
They had a piece of flint, and you can get that down the Little Miami River. Every gravel bars, it's loaded with it. But what do you strike the flint against?
Steel.
It has to be iron. 2 pieces of flint will strike. You'll see a spark, but it's a cold spark. You'll never, ever start a fire. On the other hand, we lost our Boy Scout. Oh well. So go teach him how to start a fire. Anyway, you can use an old iron file, not the new ones. The old files, rat tail files, were actually iron, and you can strike flint. What's happening, the flint is so hard, it's removing pieces of the iron, and those red hot pieces of the iron hit the dry tinder, and you can blow on that to start the fire. This appropriately was known as a strike-a-light. This is what the French fur traders, the voyageurs, brought down the Little Miami River. Guess what came from the Mariemont bottoms, from the Wainema site? There it is. This, the iron here, is French. This is 18th century. Now we're talking the 1700s. And you can see why these sites are so important down there. Now, if that wasn't enough, when we first found this, we thought, oh, that's a bone awl. It's highly ornate. That's really neat. Well, once I got it under a microscope, I thought, uh-oh. This bone awl's been turned on a lathe. They used to be my favorite tool in high school. Anyone ever use a lathe? Spins around, so it's just great fun to use. But nevertheless, I don't know if anyone here uses a flintlock, any black powder shooters or not, but nevertheless, or anyone wants to admit it. What this is about this big, and the bulbous end is when you take your musket, your muzzle loader, and you take your patch, after you put your black powder in there, you put your patch on top, you put your ball, and then after that, the end of this, the bulbous end, is used to stamp that down, and then you get your rod and you shove your ball down in there. The problem with black powder, no one wants to admit shooting black powder, is the biggest thing in the Civil War up at Camp Dennison. One of the things, after a few shots, you're all gummed up. You have to put through a mini ball that actually is smaller than the bore, so it cleans out all that gunk. Well, the hole where your spark gets on a flintlock rifle has to be clean. Guess what this end is used for right here? That's what that, and see how it's all shiny? That's been stuck again and again in the hole of a flintlock rifle. Again, who made these? This is in the 1700s. This is 18th century, and this is from down in the lower 80. And if that wasn't enough, guess what we have here? I don't know, is interesting. The types of flint used in flintlock rifles vary. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. The honey-colored flint are French, the black ones are British. And what's interesting, in Big Bone Lick, we find some that are actually made of local stone. But these are heavily exhausted. Here you can see where it hit the frizzen, the strike plate, on the flintlock. These are rifle, but that's for a pistol. So we don't have any guns, but we do have the exhausted, expended gun flints. Again, on an archaeological site, these are extremely rare. So, and again, this is the weaponry we're talking about. Again, we don't have these. They would have been carried away. They would have been very valuable. Even when the gun wasn't working, they're still great clubs. And then the metal can be extracted and used. Nothing was wasted. So this is the time period and the type of weaponry we're talking about. So in other words, when we look at the Mariemont occupation, we're talking from 13,000 years ago all the way to 1810. In other words, Mariemont's prime real estate, but I don't have to tell you that. But nonetheless, and always has been. But so one of the things Joe asked me about these paintings earlier, they're very, very old paintings, but they're depicting the early French voyageurs coming down the Ohio River, and of course, not only with the Spanish, the conquistadors, there were black robes or Jesuit priests. At that time, the Roman Catholic Church bankrolled all the expeditions. Of course, they wanted at that time to make more Catholics. And here's a Jesuit along with the Shawnee. And again, they did an incredible job. They recorded every little detail, and you can purchase that. It's been translated in English, called the Jesuit Relations. So if that wasn't enough, one of the really neat things, this one is from the Madisonville site. This is from that time period. This is a Roman Catholic chalice. So I think, note this over here. Of course, this was metal. Of course, the original one would have been ceramic. Just watch Indiana Jones. But anyway, no, we know the old ones were, because they still survive. What's interesting is at the Wainema site, we found a piece of one that was Spanish. It's actually glazed Spanish earthenware. It's just a little piece this big, but wow, you know, that's a very important discovery. Not only that, what you see here, and there were actually two of these discovered. Charles Metz made sure they ended up in the Cincinnati Art Museum. I had them transferred to the Cincinnati Museum of Natural History. They're now at the Geyer Research and Collection Center. These are called pedestal pots, but you can see what's going on here. The Fort Ancient people were in contact with the Jesuits. They're making a chalice. Basically what they did is take a kind of a classic Fort Ancient pot from the Madisonville site, what we call Madisonville cord mark. They put a pedestal on it to mimic the chalice. This was probably gifted to a Jesuit priest. There were two of these from Mariemont. Now in Petersburg, another site, Petersburg, Kentucky, there was a burial with an iron cross, a Jesuit. And I don't know if you know about the Jesuits, it was a double cross. So of course, one is the original crucifix and the other top bar represents the signage above. So that's why we call it essentially the French cross, if you will. And so direct positive evidence. Why are there French traders in Mary Lou Holt's painting? I just gave you the answer. So everything in that painting has direct correlation to the archaeological record. As to faces, expressions, yes, that's artist's fantasy. But in terms of what you have to look at is the behavior. What's going on in human livelihood? How are people making a living in Mariemont at that time period? That part's 100%. And by the way, these are recent finds, and by recent I mean the past couple weeks. And I didn't bring in all the little pieces, and just a couple readily identifiable. There's a bead. And this is really interesting. We call these gorgets, but if you look real close, you'll see it looks like silver. This is actually a mineral called galena. I put it in glass because cerussite is toxic. I don't want anyone to get lead poisoning. But these are two, and again, there are many sites now in the lower 80, and we keep finding them. One of the most exciting, one of them is over 20 feet below the surface. So that's rather remarkable. And we'll be down there documenting on June 1st, provided it's not pouring down the rain. Anyway, good place for me to stop, and all the people that I want to thank that I couldn't have done any of this work without you. So, be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Yes?
So the Indian that is buried on top of the hill, he's still not there, is he? He is?
Where? Do you know where?
You know what road goes up from Plainville straight up to the top?
Indian Hill Road.
That's right, Indian Hill Road. That's why it's called that. Now, if I tell you this, you're not going to dig him up, are you?
I've already got a vision of it.
The road makes a right-hand turn. Right on the right.
Is there a marker there, or?
There was. Charles Metz put a marker there. So, in fact, I'd like to take credit for all this research, but all this is in our new book on Mariemont, on the early history of Mariemont. But there was, Metz put at places major historic events where you could connect what we call the ethnographic or ethno-historic past to the present. He put large stones. Unfortunately, a lot of these large stones people removed and put in their yards and gardens. And you see them around. There used to be one by the Heritage Restaurant, and I don't know where that ended up. But there was a very large stone. When I was, as recently 1969 to around 73, that stone was still there. When I moved away from the area and came back 15 years ago, I went up to relocate it, and it was gone. But it's private property. We could do ground penetrating radar and relocate it. But it'd be nice to have a marker. I don't know how many people live in Indian Hill have not a clue as to why it's called Indian Hill.
I can't believe they haven't preserved that.
Yeah, me too. I'm hoping to talk to the Indian Hill Historical Society and see what we do. I did have a meeting at Camargo Club last week with Tony Woodward, Cincinnati Preservation Association. So I need to, that's some of those connections I need to, because whether you realize it or not, the highway affects them. It's hard to imagine. I didn't realize, my friend Tony Woodward, grandson of the namesake of Woodward High School, but anyway, he lives on Park in Indian Hill, and he says when the wind's blowing a certain direction, he wakes up from I-275 noise. I had no idea living in Indian Hill that there was actually noise from I-275. So you can imagine getting the highway even closer. So, but anyway, so yes.
This is like the Mariemont Historic Roadshow.
Oh, wonderful.
See if you can found that in the gravel down by the little underpass by the South 80.
Anyone know what it is? I do. You know what it is? That's a gem. That's a real gem. Probably when I was a kid, of course, I shouldn't confess all my sins. I mean, I used to hunt down lower 80s when I was, I remember walking through Madison Place with a single shot 410 shotgun with the bolt open. You wonder why they wouldn't rent an apartment to me. But I walk right through, and it's perfectly legal. We go down and shoot rabbits. I took a 222 to hunt groundhogs and all that. But another thing we did was trap. So I wouldn't ever do that anymore, but we trapped along the Little Miami River. That's from a jump trap. So, but that's an old jump trap. That's one where you have to, it actually goes this way. So you have to put all your weight to press down to open that up. That's a cool artifact.
If you want, you can keep it in your collection.
Excellent. Well, one thing I should point out is the collection. I need you to show me where it came from, so we can document it, because that's you discovered a new site, and What's interesting we've learned about the sand and gravel deposits is the artifacts, especially things like this, don't move very far. So they're pretty close to where they were found. So we can look at the stream bank and see where this originally came from. But you've added another time period. This is British. So so this is after French, but again, not surprising. This is a time period before anyone was living in this area. So this is the time period that I was just talking of, you know, around 1810, very late 1700s, early 1800s, probably right between the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. Really neat find. That's neat. So I can key that out, but I've excavated complete ones before, so I recognize it.
Right, I can show you. Yeah.
Excellent. And by the way, ultimately, everything we find belongs to Mariemont. So we're curating them right now at a beloved friend who's passed away, but before he did, John C. Court, he loved the archaeology of this area, and on his deathbed, he said, I want you to be proactive. I want you to get politically involved. And he was very politically involved, so here I am. But anyway, he gave me over $1 million, and I built I have what's called, I'd love to show it to you, it's called the John C. Court Archaeological Research Facility. It's a temperature humidity controlled archaeological research facility, and so everything, including that small pot that went around, that all belongs to Mariemont. So one day when you get an exhibition area, it all goes there, or even if you want it sooner. But that's actually a very precious artifact. It's my students would say way cool. So, anyway, no, that's really a neat discovery. So thank you. So, but afterwards we'll exchange information and we'll go down there. So,
Hey Ken,
yes.
can you explain what ODOT has tried to do? The whole valley at one point was a historic, I forget the
Oh
terminology.
yeah, National Register Archaeological District. And that's thank you for bringing that up. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I was in San Francisco. I was coming home when Joe was headed out to California, and I was just coming back. But I ran into, I was giving a talk at the University of California, Berkeley, and I ran into, of all people, the Ohio State Historic Preservation Officer. And trying to be political, I thanked him for letting my students have access to the records. Actually, he had to, Freedom of Information Act. So, but nevertheless, but I thanked him for helping. And now that I got the records, now I see they're wrong. But anyway, I asked him, he's very cordial, very nice, until I said, you know, from valley wall to valley wall, this was a National Register Archaeological District. I said, all of a sudden, you erased the Mariemont side of the river. I said, now I know ODOT, that's their prime area of trying to put a highway through at that time. How did that happen? And I said, of course, guess where we looked and guess what we found? I said, that site would have been protected even though it had not been discovered at that time on the National Register. He wouldn't answer me. He would not answer me. Of course, ODOT's right next door, so of course they walked in and said, there's nothing on the other side of the river, and so I keep waiting for ODOT to put a hit out on me. So, but anyhow, anyway, but nevertheless, I don't know why. Well, of course, normally I would scream legal foul. I'd say they've committed a felony, but I can't, because the Department of the Interior, which oversees the National Historic Preservation Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, 3 federal laws which protect not only archaeological but historic sites and districts. And that's why we were up in the village surveying to make sure, the village doesn't get removed from the National Register. is that essentially they've been given, I learned this through a Sierra Club attorney, they've been given permission to regulate themselves. It's the fox guarding the hen house. So that's how it happened. Of course, he would not say a word to me. He was right. And after that, after my question, he walked away, unfortunately. So, but I'll continue to be cordial, and he probably will not be happy at the end of the summer when I give him back his files with the correct locations of archaeological sites, as well as all the new ones that we've been finding. So,
Well, Ken, do you think we can bring it back where we are a part of that?
oh,
The Hahn Fields and make the whole valley?
we're gonna make them.
Historic.
So, absolutely. The thing is to get an overwhelming body of evidence, and that's one of the things that I was just appalled was ODOT in 2007 did, because of the National Environmental Policy Act, they had to address endangered species. So they hired a biologist from the University of Cincinnati, Mike Miller, to do the Great Miami River, and they hired another environmental firm to do the Little Miami River. Now keep in mind, the Great Miami River has Fernald. You know what Fernald is?
Yeah.
Nuclear waste from
Very polluted.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Guess what's in the groundwater? It's not, is it in the groundwater? It's how fast and what directions it's moving in. They said that river's okay, but the Little Miami River, because there's so much sewage being dumped upstream, they blame the Loveland sewage up there. See one pedaled up by Loveland on the left-hand side of the Arrowhead Apartments, there's a little sewage treatment. It's a little plant. And there used to be a trailer park off on the left, not outside of Miami town. Well, they were dumping their raw sewage in the Little Miami River. These are two small areas. Yes, no would I drink the water, but I still swam in it. But once on a hot day, I'll jump off the bridge. But nonetheless, I'll swim in it. But on the other hand, they said that caused the extinction of endangered species that had been previously discovered. Well, 2 weeks ago, 2 of the endangered species that they said no longer were there, we found in the gravel bar in the lower 80. So one of the things is I'm encouraging, I have a biologist, a botanist by the name of Dennis Conover from the Department of Biology at the University of Cincinnati to do the plants. And I'm trying to convince Stan Hedin, he's a former dean, you probably see him, he walks from Alt Park down to the lower 80 every day to bird watch. First he starts at Armletter, then he comes up through Little Miami Conservation Area, and then into the lower 80 and back. You'll see him with his binoculars. And he's also, in addition, he's an ecologist besides his birding, and he's been making a remarkable inventory of birds in the lower Little Miami River Valley. But in addition to that, he's a mollusk expert. So I've been, every time I see him, I said, I need to get you on board to do a mollusk survey. So what they did was they took a boat up and down the Little Miami River, and they shocked it with electricity, and then netted the fish to see what was there. And they said all this threatened species are now gone, which is, it's just complete nonsense. It's another way of them covering themselves for that federal law. So the only way to do it, it's like the archaeology, is to do it ourselves, and to do it not for pay. To do it, you know, it's just purely research, so they can't say we're making any money off of it. So, yes.
Are they still dumping sewage and Loveland into the Little Miami River?
The Loveland is, but they clean it, to my knowledge. That's not my area of expertise, but the trailer park was destroyed. And so that trailer park, that was just pure raw sewage that was going into the Little Miami River. My grandfather's fishing camp was right on the other side, and literally right on the other side of the road on the Little Miami River. It was horrible, but it's gone. I hate to say it, I'm the one who ratted them out, but yeah.
Is that Remington Lake Remington, is that what you're talking
That's
about?
right.
Okay.
That's the spot. So, and it wasn't a nice place to begin with, so, but, and quite, I mean, I won't even go into what was going on there, but, it was the sewage that got me. I didn't even get into the illegal activities there, so, but it's gone now. It's been torn down. Yes, that's the spot. And by the way, whether you realize it or not, has anyone been to Grand Valley? You know where Grand Valley, it used to be the old Gervaux gravel pit. If you receive Milford water, you can be a member for $75 a year. One of the interesting things, it's where Milford and Indian Hill, others get their water supply. What's interesting, that's a gravel pit, as all the other gravel pits. Whether you realize it or not, the water's flowing. Those are exposures of the aquifer. And you can actually measure the current in the gravel pit. Those are underground aquifers. And in those gravel pits, it's exposed. So that one's 60 feet deep. It also was full of cannonballs from practicing during the Civil War at Camp Dennison. So, but nonetheless. So that's another very important, is the fresh water. This area is one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the United States. So another, aspect of it as well. But their side of it is old electrical transformers were dumped in the gravel pits, and they have PCBs. It's all contaminated. Anyway, that's the kind of argument they make.
There were cars dumped in the gravel pit.
Exactly.
I used to swim there as a teenager.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Good. Well, Dr. Tankersley, thank you so much again, and appreciate
Thanks for having me.
every time you come is just fascinating. I hope your book is sort of a download of your knowledge, because it's
Oh, yeah.
just fascinating to hear so many connections that you always bring forward.
Thank you.